Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning for this important announcement. We want to start with some introductions. City Attorney Pete Holmes and I are joined by a number of folks we want to introduce up front before we get to our remarks. So first, you all know, of course, to my right, Seattle City Attorney Pete Holmes. We're here today to announce two major lawsuits related to the opioid epidemic in our state. So I will introduce members of my team first. So we have two AAGs, Assistant Attorneys General from my office who work in our Consumer Protection Division. Tad Robinson O'Neill is to my right here, and also joined by Kate Barak. And Kate is to my right as well. So those are two attorneys from our Consumer Protection Division in the Washington State Office of the Attorney General. Pete and I also have a very special guest I would like to introduce. Her name is Rose Dennis. Rose is to my left. Rose, later on, Pete will be introducing her, but she'll be sharing her personal story that relates to this epidemic, and we greatly appreciate Rose being here. And I'll let Pete introduce the folks from his team and the city.
Thank you, Bob. From my office, I want to introduce Tad Cedar, Assistant City Attorney. In our torts section, Deputy City Attorney Michelle Chen. They have been at work on this for many months, along with our outside counsel, Steve Berman of the Hagen Berman's firm. We're really honored to have Molly Carney here today. Molly is the Executive Director of Evergreen Treatment Services. Chief Wilski from Seattle Police Department, immediately behind me. Chief Gonzalez from the Seattle Fire Department. Dr. Sayer, a Chief Medical Officer with the Fire Department, and Jeff Sakuma. Jeff, where are you? Jeff is with the King County Public Health. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. So I'll give some opening remarks. We'll also hear from City Attorney Pete Holmes. These are two separate lawsuits, and then we'll hear from Rose. And then, of course, we'll be happy to take questions that you may have, and we look forward to those questions. On average, 2 Washingtonians die every day from opioid overdoses. Between 2009 and 2014, Washington State saw a 60% increase in opioid-related hospital stays. That's the 4th highest increase in the entire country. In 2015, the number of overdose deaths in Washington exceeded the number of deaths from car accidents or deaths from firearms, whether from suicide, homicide, or accidental. Since 2000, opioids have killed nearly 10,000 Washingtonians. Millions of opioid prescriptions are given out every single year. To give you a sense of scale of that volume, taking the year 2011 as an example, there was essentially a 16-day supply for every man, woman, and child in the entire state of Washington. Today, City Attorney Pete Holmes and I are filing separate lawsuits. I'll focus on Washington's, and Pete will talk about the City of Seattle's lawsuit. So today, the state of Washington filed a lawsuit against Purdue Pharma, one of the largest opioid manufacturers in our country. They're the maker of OxyContin and other long-acting opioids. Purdue has made billions of dollars by fueling Washington's opioid epidemic by knowingly deceiving doctors and the public about the risks of long-term opioid use. We're here today at Harborview Medical Center, which from our perspective is really the front lines of this epidemic. As we're here today, there are more than 100 patients who are here at Harborview who are getting treatment for their addiction to opioids. So I'll talk about Purdue's illegal conduct, what we're seeking with our lawsuit, and Pete will of course talk about Seattle's lawsuit. So I want to be clear about one thing about our lawsuit. Purdue Pharma has knowingly conducted an uncontrolled experiment on the people of Washington State and the American public without any reliable clinical evidence that opioids are safe or even effective for treating long-term chronic pain. Now, our complaint's about 130 pages, so I'm going to give a very high-level overview of our complaint. Our press release, which will be available very soon, if not already, will go into more detail, but we're going to have to necessarily keep this at a relatively high level. But to push its pills, Purdue made false claims about the effectiveness of opioids for the treatment of long-term chronic pain. They downplayed the significant risk of patients becoming addicted to opioids, and they made false claims about the overdose risks associated with high doses of opioids. I'll briefly talk about each one of those claims. So first, Purdue's false claims that opioids are effective for treating chronic pain. Again, without any reliable clinical evidence, Purdue has for years aggressively marketed its opioids for chronic pain like headaches and lower back pain. Yet the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has clearly stated and reinforced just last year that, quote, there is no good evidence that opioids improve pain or function with long-term use. Further, other safer options are available and effective and carry fewer risks, the CDC made clear. Another one of our claims is that Purdue has claimed that there is a very low risk that patients will become addicted to its opioids. Again, Purdue has claimed that there is a very low risk that patients will become addicted to its opioids. In advertising, medical journal articles, videos, pamphlets, and more, Purdue claims that opioids have a low addiction risk that can be managed or prevented, and that increased doses of opioids do not pose significant additional risks to patients. In some of its materials, Purdue has claimed that opioid addiction occurred in less than 1% of patients. That number, you won't be surprised to learn, is not based on a clinical study, but rather a 1980, this is not an exaggeration, a 1980 letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's what it's based on. A study sponsored by Purdue asserted that, and I'm quoting now, opioids were well tolerated with only rare incidents of addiction. That's a quote. And the need for higher and higher doses as patients built up tolerance to opioids, I'm quoting now, was not a clinically significant problem when managing patients with opioids long term. When signs of addiction appeared in their patients, Purdue persuaded doctors that what appeared to be addiction was actually under-treatment of their pain, and to respond to that by increasing opioid dosages. So I want to be clear, people came in showing signs of addiction. Purdue's response was, that's not addiction, give them more of those drugs. In fact, doctors were told by Purdue that the symptoms were not addiction, but a term they coined, pseudo-addiction. Purdue told doctors that the proper response was to increase opioid dosages. In their publications and marketing, Purdue told doctors that, and I'm quoting now, pain relief-seeking behavior can often be mistaken for drug-seeking behavior, and that, quote, the behaviors resolve when the pain is effectively treated. One more claim is that Purdue ignored the overdose risk associated with high doses of opioids. The FDA has made clear that the risk of abuse is greatest for extended-release opioids like the ones that Purdue produced. The risk of overdose, not surprisingly, multiplies as the dose increases. 1 in 32 patients die of opioid-related causes at a dose of 200 morphine milligram equivalents per day. Regardless of the science, Purdue sales representatives were trained to reassure prescribers that there is, quote, no ceiling, that's a quote, there's no ceiling on the amount of OxyContin a patient could be prescribed. No ceiling. So here's what we'll be seeking with the state of Washington's lawsuit. In addition to civil penalties and damages, we're asking the court to order Purdue to give up the profits it made in Washington state as a result of its illegal conduct. As you might imagine, the sales of Purdue opioids are worth billions of dollars every year nationwide. We do not have a precise dollar amount, as you might suspect, on what those claims will be. The lawsuit will continue. We'll get additional discovery, but it'd be a very significant recovery that we'd be seeking. At this time, I'd like to turn now to City Attorney Pete Holmes, who will walk through the city case. Again, just want to make clear, these are two separate lawsuits that are being filed. But Pete's just been such a great partner on this issue and many others. We've worked together now for as long as I've been Attorney General, and I think this just is a good example of our teams being well coordinated, working well together on behalf of the residents of the City of Seattle and of the state as a whole. So, Pete, thank you for being here and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, General Ferguson. Thanks for our two teams working together. I think it does send a powerful message when the top lawyers for the state and the state's largest city are sending a clear message about trying to recover for the harms caused to our communities. I'm going to focus, as General Ferguson said, on Seattle's specific issues because like other communities nationwide, we are, of course, suffering from the opioid crisis that's devastating lives and tearing apart families. We know that addiction doesn't discriminate. It affects rich and poor, all socioeconomic groups and ethnic groups, and it doesn't stop at the city limits. We had in King County a record 332 people die last year of an overdose. That's according to the University of Washington. And then of those deaths, more than 2/3 died of an opioid-related overdose. Seattle has a navigation team addressing the problems of homelessness in our streets. We estimate that 80% of the people living in our most challenging encampments throughout the city have substance use disorders. According to Evergreen Treatment Services, and Molly Carney is here today from that organization, an opioid addiction treatment center, 90% of their admissions are active heroin users who started with prescription opioids, and 40% of their patients are homeless. Unlike earthquakes and hurricanes, this disaster is a human-made crisis. The lawsuit that I filed today on behalf of the City of Seattle is to hold accountable, first and foremost, those who have caused the harm to this city. Our second major issue here is to recover some of the funds, some of the expenses that I will outline here momentarily. And then finally, we're also seeking a third major area of recovery is to try and undo some of the marketing harm that has been caused by an education program for the medical community to teach the true harms, the true dangers of opioids. We know, again, that this is motivated by profit and greed. We believe the number is around $11 billion annually that the industry is enjoying in profits every year. And you know, when you put that in context, the United States has slightly less than 5% of the world's population, but we consume 80% of all opiates and 95% of OxyContin in particular, 95% worldwide. We know that the defendants, as General Ferguson outlined, deliberately and knowingly lied about the risk of their drugs, and they flooded the market with opioids, knowing that these pills would be diverted for illegal use. And through this lawsuit, as I said, we seek to recover financially from the entities that caused the harm. We spend currently, the City of Seattle, over $50 million to mitigate the impact of homelessness through our Human Services Department. We invest in services, permanent housing, and emergency shelters. And while the primary cause of an individual's homelessness are not always clear, in Seattle, according to our 2016 needs assessment, a primary cause of homelessness is drug or substance abuse, and it is second only to job loss. Our public health system, our criminal justice system, and our human services safety net are incredibly stressed and maxed out by the surge in opioid and heroin use. And through this lawsuit, I hope to recoup for the public and for city departments that have had to spend more of their limited resources on mitigating the harm caused by the opioid crisis. Our first responders, represented by the Seattle Fire Department and Police Department, are dealing daily with overdoses instead of fighting fires and patrolling our streets. Our transportation and parks departments are picking up needles and trash instead of paving roads and landscaping. Our communities are suffering, and as the city attorney, I intend to stand up against these corporate interests that put profits ahead of well-being of people and fight to recover what has been lost to this growing epidemic. So in closing, I want to say that no one is untouched by this opioid epidemic. Seattle will continue to lead with progressive values, and instead of locking people up and expecting the criminal justice system to deal with it and our failed drug laws, we're taking a different approach. This lawsuit is one way that we can bring more resources to help the thousands of people in our community recover from addiction and rebuild their lives. And through the justice system, we will hold those accountable for the current opioid crisis and make them pay. We want to bring some measure of hope and healing to those whose lives have been ruined and are on a path to recovery. And with that, I want to ask Rose Dennis to step forward. Rose's son became addicted to opioids while undergoing treatment for leukemia at age 12. She is now an advocate for those suffering from the disease of addiction. Thank you. Rose?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm here today to share with you the tragic disease of opiate addiction. My son, who was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 12, was introduced to opiates. He spent 9 months in the hospital hooked up to an opiate drip to deal with the pain of his chemotherapy. I remember visiting him one day at the hospital, and he shared, "Mom, this is my happy time," and asked me to leave the room. I left the room with tears, knowing that we had a serious problem. It was never mentioned to us that one of the side effects of his cancer would be opiate addiction. We shared our concerns with the doctors, and they had no response. He left the hospital after 9 months, cured of cancer, but with the disease of addiction. This should never have happened to him. As a young boy, he loved sports and wanted to be a doctor. This is not the life he chose for himself. Since the age of 13, he has been living with this disease. When opiates were not available to him, he used heroin. He is now 31, and for 18 very long years, he has been fighting the demons of opiate and heroin addiction. On behalf of my husband and myself, thank you, Attorney General Bob Ferguson and City Attorney Pete Holmes, for doing the right thing, requiring Purdue to be responsible for destroying people's lives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rose, for being here. We appreciate it. Just a final thought, then we'll turn to your questions. Rose's story is just one of many, many thousands, as you know, here in our communities in the city of Seattle and our state more broadly. From my perspective, Purdue's conduct, it's hard to find the right word sometimes, right? But I think, Pete, you referenced to their pursuit of profits, right? They did. Blinded by pursuit of profits, billions and billions of dollars, they ignored what was going on in our communities all across this country for their bottom line. That's not right. It is our job to hold them accountable for that, and that's what these two lawsuits are all about. One thing I should have mentioned, and we'll turn to your questions, is Washington has been a part of a multi-state lawsuit that's been in the news. Our involvement has not been. We don't talk about our investigations on any case that we have going on, but you've likely read about a large group of attorneys general involved in a multi-state. We were part of the lead group of states helping to lead that effort. Obviously, by taking this action, Washington State's pulled out of that multi-state for a variety of reasons. I feel this is the right course of action for Washington State to bring this litigation at this time, separate from that multi-state litigation. Washington has now joined, I think, a handful of other states have filed separate lawsuits as well. So it's our goal as we work on these separate lawsuits, to hold Purdue and others accountable for this conduct that has devastated so many families and communities across our state. With that, we'll start with questions here in the room. We'll then take some on the phone. We'll do our best to introduce ourselves as we speak and repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Go right ahead.
Sort of a two-part question. Where has the Federal Drug Administration been in all this? And two, how do you know that, I guess I'm asking for your proof that that the opioids are ineffective, and how do you know that they're deliberately overstating the effectiveness and understating the addictive effects?
Did you want to? I'll start then. There's a two-part question. I think one relates to the FDA. What's the?
Shouldn't the FDA be?
So how's the FDA involved in this?
Regulating all this already.
I guess what I'll focus on is, and what we focus on is illegal conduct in our state. And so, again, it's a 130-page complaint. So I'm speaking at a very, very high level, right? However, we have a Consumer Protection Act in our state. One cannot engage in unfair or deceptive practices as an entity in our state. And it's our allegations that is what's going on by Purdue Pharma, okay, and how they discuss, promote, their drugs. And that's the focus of our complaint at this time. And the second part of your question, again, was on the...
Where's the FDA in all this? Shouldn't they have already been regulating this?
Do you want to speak to anything like that?
Well, the FDA...
Take the microphone if you want to.
You bet.
Yeah.
No, FDA probably should be stepping up more than they have. However, this is designed to accomplish some specific tasks, recovering for our damages. And the FDA would not be the likely entity to go after Seattle's or the state of Washington's specific damages. So that falls to us.
Okay, but shouldn't the FDA be saying, if Purdue's basing this on a 1980 letter to the editor, shouldn't the FDA have already looked at these?
I think that's a
and
question.
said,
It's a question for the
"These
FDA.
are-
I think it's a good question for the
this
FDA.
is-
It's a good question for the FDA. Yeah, we're focused on illegal conduct we see with these defendants. Yes.
Bob, part of the argument that Purdue's been making in court is that they're wholesalers of the drug, that they're not selling directly to the consumers,
Mhm.
therefore they can't be held liable.
Sure. So I may ask Tad or Kate to add to this as well, but the question went to a part of Purdue's defense is that they're selling directly to doctors, for example, right? They can't be held accountable. How one advertises one's product, wherever that's going to, wherever that advertising is, you've got to follow our state laws. You've got to follow our Consumer Protection Act. You cannot deceive any part of the public with that advertising, and that's what Purdue has done here. The end result of where the damage is done, of course, is to folks like Rose's sons and other families, individuals across our state. But that does not absolve, just in terms of where they are advertising, that doesn't change the fact that they've got to follow our Consumer Protection Act and how they engage in their conduct. So I'm going to ask you, is there anything you want to add on that, Tad, or feel free to come to the mic. So this is Tad, who I introduced early, an Assistant Attorney General in our office who's been involved in the case. Feel free to add to that if you like.
The only thing I would add to that is that the lawsuit that we filed today is just one step in the Attorney General's investigation and actions in opioid. So this is targeted on their marketing, which is something that distributors, if they're the wholesalers, they're also the marketers. They're the ones in doctors' offices. They're the ones that are putting out advertisements. They're paying for studies and then disseminating studies that don't have all of the information or are not scientifically sound. So this is about their responsibility. There are many other entities that may well be at fault, and this lawsuit doesn't change that.
And I'd add that they did market directly to consumers. They do. We've seen those advertisements on websites, on TV. So there's direct marketing that goes on as well. The head in the sand defense is not going to work.
And just
Yep.
to follow
Go
up on
ahead.
that, just are you specifically there for claiming that doctors were misled in this state, not the public in the state's lawsuit? And if so, are there doctors who are saying that they were misled by this advertising and are going to be defense for you?
Tad, I just want to make sure on the legal side we get that right. Do you mind paraphrasing the question? This will be Tad answering for those on the phone.
So the question was whether or not we were alleging that the doctors were deceived by the marketing of Purdue, and the answer to that question is yes. We do believe that doctors were deceived at continuing medical education courses, in in-person detailing by sales representatives. So we do allege that they were being deceived by Purdue and reassured in misleading ways that they could continue prescribing opioids in spite of the growing and irrefutable proof of the harm that it causes.
Follow up.
Let's get a few. We've got a few others who have questions. So yeah, go right ahead.
Can you talk a little bit more about the multi-state litigation?
Sure.
Whether
Don't go too far.
why didn't you consider that to be a good avenue for Washington's claims? And
Sure.
why is this a better approach?
So the question goes to my comment near the end about the multi-state in Washington, pulling out the multi-state, and the reasons for that, I think, is what you're getting at. I should make clear, a multi-state investigation, we do this in consumer protection or antitrust routinely. It's not uncommon for AGs to work together on all sorts of cases. Those can be, multi-state can be a handful of states, or it can be almost every state. Once we're in a multi-state, we typically remain within it. There are pros and cons of being a part of a multi-state. The advantages are obvious, right? You get to share resources on big, complex litigation like this, which I can assure you, these are large, very complex pieces of litigation to put together. So there are advantages to it. For any multi-state, there are obviously disadvantages, right? In my view, you are only as aggressive as your least aggressive state in the multi-state, right? And so as the Attorney General, it's my job to make the decision of, hey, what's best for Washingtonians in a case of this magnitude? Is it best to stay in a multi-state with the advantages and disadvantages that brings, or to go our own way? This is a resource-intense effort to go your own way on a case of this magnitude. But when we have gone our own way in the past, we've had cases where when we've gone our own way, I feel the results have been very positive for the state of Washington. And so from my perspective, the bottom line also was that we were ready to go with Purdue. The team's been working hard. We feel we have a case that's ready to go. There's a crisis in our communities right now on this issue, right? My view is it can't wait another day. That's not a criticism of the multi-state and my colleagues who are doing that really important work as a multi-state. I look forward to what the results of their investigation. But for me, representing the people of the state that I represent, it seemed to me that we were ready to go, we could act right away, and it was important to take on, we felt, the largest entity involved in this epidemic.
Have you reached
Yep.
out at all in terms of settlement talks or trying to get any kind of deal with the pharmaceutical companies?
The question goes to settlement talks. We've been focused on filing our complaint, so that's what we're doing today. Yes?
Clarify why the state named Purdue only while the city named several different entities.
Sure, I probably should have addressed that. Thanks for that question. The question goes to the state's lawsuit addresses Purdue only. The city has Purdue and a few other defendants as
Quite a
well.
few others.
Yep. So the question is why only Purdue? Well, part of it goes back to the point I just addressed, which is first, Purdue's the largest. Number two, we've been part of a multi-state that's been broad in its scope. We felt we were ready to go with Purdue, which is the largest. That does not preclude further action by the state on others as well. We, of course, not talk about investigations that we have, but you know, I think it's fair to say that I'm intensely interested in the subject and want to be able to move as quickly as we can in a responsible way. And so because we're ready to Purdue, we're moving forward, but that doesn't preclude us, obviously, from filing additional litigation if we feel that's appropriate down the road.
There's a mention of Seattle pain centers. Can you talk about why they were specifically listed?
Just repeat the question.
You bet. Repeating the question, this is Pete Holmes. Why was the Pain Center named as one of our defendants? We know that that entity was culpable. We know that they even went above and beyond some of the marketing. And while they are not currently in business, we would like injunctive relief to make sure that that never opens again, to make sure that they never are peddling opioids again.
The question goes
Yes.
both of you. You mentioned the urgency with this. The opioid epidemic is not new. Why now and not before with these lawsuits?
For us, you're ready when you're ready. We've been researching this for some time now, and you know, when we file a lawsuit, it's serious. We're with it. Not that others aren't, but that, you know, we want to make sure we have understood our particular damages. We have to know the extent of the harm caused. We have to be certain of our legal theories. We have to examine things, for instance, why not be in federal court versus state court? Those are all things that went into our analysis, our judgment, and our teams working together, I think, recognized that this was the approach that was going to be best for our clients.
And I think I essentially answered the question earlier. We've obviously been part of a multi-state for some time. I'll let the multi-state speak about how long that investigation's been going on, but obviously we've been involved in this issue for quite a period of time, and I simply reached the conclusion, in part to your question, right? Things are happening, bad things are happening in our communities, we need to act quickly, and I just felt it was time to go our own way. So, but we've obviously been engaged with the multi-state for some time.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering if the decision by the judge yesterday to allow the city of Everett's case to move forward is a reason why today was chosen as a day to go ahead and file. Because you guys said you were ready for some time, but then.
The question goes to a decision on the Everett case, which is against Purdue. They had a positive outcome from a hearing yesterday. No, that has nothing to do with our timing. We've been the state's been on our calendar for some time for this announcement. Our team's been working hard to be ready by the state. So no, it's not related to that. That said, the news in the court for that case in Everett is obviously very positive. The court essentially allowing Everett to continue with its litigation against Purdue. We think that's a positive development, but no, it's not related at all to our announcement. Pete, anything you want to add to that?
You know, and Everett does have some unique circumstances about, you know, specific as a destination endpoint for trafficking. So they were uniquely situated with some additional facts.
So why don't we take a couple on the phone, then we'll come back to a couple in the room. I see another hand here as well. So I know it's always tricky on the phone with multiple voices, but we'll do our best to take a couple questions on the phone if you have them. Go right ahead.
KTJ, what's the Jerry Cornfield
addiction of Everett, could you may have answered, but can you distinguish the key differences between the state's lawsuit and what the city is attempting to do, and where they overlap?
So I think that was Jerry, if I heard correctly. I may have Tad address that if he can. So I think the question, if I heard it correctly, said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that comparing the state's lawsuit with the city of Everett's lawsuit, is that, I just want to make sure I heard that right. Is that correct?
Correct. The differences and the similarities.
So I guess Tad, I'm not sure if you had a chance to review Everett's in some detail, but Tad from my team will take that.
So the city of Everett's lawsuit is it's a very targeted lawsuit relating to diversion to a specific gang and a specific pharmacy in California that Purdue was supplying with hundreds of thousands of OxyContin pills that were then being distributed directly to Everett. And so it's a much narrower lawsuit targeted at that one distribution chain. The state's lawsuit is aims at the entire state and distribution and detailing visits throughout the state. And I'll let.
I think I've answered the question.
Thanks, Jerry. I think someone else was trying to jump over the question as well.
Casey?
KCJ
Oh,
works
Casey.
Seattle Weekly.
Thanks.
General Ferguson, Attorney Holmes, both of you talked about the liability that this creates for Purdue and Big Pharma more generally. Does that liability extend to the doctors who did the prescribing as well? Were they asleep at the wheel? Are they either morally or legally liable for being on board with the advertising campaign and overprescribing opioids? And then on the side of people who have gotten in trouble for drug laws, as Attorney Holmes mentioned earlier, do we need to do more in terms of removing legal liability and decriminalizing those people by the logic of this lawsuit?
We've named the pain clinic. That's really the only practitioner named in our lawsuit, and I think that presented unique circumstances, extremely clear culpability. But really, on this point, our lawsuit is actually seeking to undo the marketing harm, that message, through education. We want to see Big Pharma start to undo some of the false education, if you will, of the medical community that was really driven by profits, not by medical science.
And this is Bob. I may have Tad add just a point or two on your question as well, Casey.
So the practice of medicine is regulated in the state by a series of state boards. There was just legislation passed this legislative session requiring those boards to issue new regulations related to the practice of medicine and opioid prescribing. The first public hearings on that were last week, and there will be future public hearings. So I don't want to comment on physicians or what the appropriate practice of medicine ought to be given the state of the science. This lawsuit, though, is focused on Purdue's marketing and the ways in which it manipulated physicians into believing that these drugs were safe.
Is there another question on the line before we turn back here for a final question? Or,
You also asked about people who were caught up in the system because of their addictions. Could you also address that, please?
I'm sorry.
Did you have?
I didn't understand the question, Gene.
Casey had also asked about people who were caught up in the system because of their addiction and as a result of this, and whether more needs to be done to help them, get their criminal records clean or whatever. Can you also address that, please?
That was part of Casey's question.
Sure. You're talking about, for instance, Rose's son, but to the extent that people have actually then, as a result of an addiction, been caught up in the criminal justice system, we'll have to address these. I think that we've got, we're in essence, finally, I believe, turning a corner where previously we've been addicted as a society, if you will, to using law enforcement to address a public health problem. This represents an opportunity for us to finally hold marketers accountable and to get some resources to help fund the necessary public health response to a public health problem. So you're correct. There has absolutely been problems from the criminal justice system being used as the first responder, if you will. That is, I think, has been wrong-headed. That is typical of the war on drugs. And the opioid crisis has been caught up in that same failed strategy.
I guess I'll just add just a little. I think I don't know much to add to what Pete said. Apologies, Casey, if we missed the second part of your question on that. But I think a point we've tried to emphasize, and it's worth reemphasizing, is no one or two lawsuits is going to solve this problem by any stretch of the imagination, right? I think Pete's words are right, that these lawsuits are about accountability for an especially egregious actor, okay? It's an important part of addressing the epidemic and holding important entities accountable. That said, we are acutely aware, as is everybody here behind us, we can assure you of the broad challenges we have in facing this epidemic. We had in the AG's office a 2-day conference not too long ago at the University of Washington related to the opioid epidemic. I remember my team said they wanted to hold it in a lecture hall at Kane Hall. I remember saying to them, we can't, I've been in those lecture halls, right? They're huge. You can't get 500 or 600 people to fill it, right? They said, no, we think the interest is there. Every seat was taken. People all around the state, healthcare officials, elected officials, law enforcement, you name it, they were there. The interest is intense. You can be sure that my office, with our legislative agenda, which we'll be finalizing soon, there will be policy proposals from my office, AG request legislation to the legislature related to the opioid epidemic and things we can do, building off successes in other states. I don't want to prejudge those now. That's not what this press conference is about. But I think we all agree that that there needs to be a multifaceted approach to address this issue. But this is an important step in holding accountable a particularly egregious actor, and it is our goal, as Pete pointed out, that we hope and anticipate that this case will result in a significant payment that will help on many of these issues and for individuals who are facing the types of struggles that Rose's son is facing. How about we go back in the room for a final question? Has anyone not had a chance to ask a question yet who wants to? Yes, go ahead.
I think you just covered my
Okay, perfect.
Okay,
Yeah,
I've got
go ahead.
2 unrelated questions. One, for the doctors who prescribe this, don't they have medical journals in the New England Journal of Medicine? Essentially, don't the medical journals address what's effective and what's not effective in opioids? Second question is, been looking at these maps here, and I don't see any discernible pattern between east side, west side, rural, urban on overdoses or excessive prescriptions. Why do you have excessive stuff in some very incredibly rural counties, but not in other rural counties, and the same thing with some of the urban counties?
So
Say, like, for
Tad, let's give Tad a chance to take that. We're happy to chat afterwards as well, and my policy
Okay.
team's here as well. If that might be simpler, but
That's fine.
Tad, if you're able to address that.
One of the reasons we're filing this lawsuit is we don't know fully the explanation for why there's a particular pattern of opioid overdoses in the state of Washington. As you've noted on the map, Clallam County is one of the leading states in terms of per capita deaths as a result of opioid overdoses. It's one of our smaller counties, and it's also one of the highest per capita prescriptions are written for opioids, and that's a pattern that the data suggests, that where there are high prescriptions of opioids being written by physicians, there are high numbers of people who are dying of drug overdoses, and there are higher hospitalization rates. It's such a strong correlation that we believe that it establishes or begins to establish causation as well. But that's not fully explored. That's one of the reasons why this litigation is being brought.
Okay,
And-
don't doctors?
So we're gonna, we've got to wrap up, but we're gonna be available to take
Okay.
questions one-on-one. So why don't we do this? I think Rose, myself, Pete, and our respective teams are available afterward to take questions one-on-one. Pete, you have a final word before we?
You know, I think that the collaboration between our 2 offices is something that has been rewarding to me as a lawyer. I think that, you know, we put our heads together. That's really what lawyers should be doing. We need to have medical professionals helping us with this problem. They need resources, and the lawyer's role is not to incarcerate Gene in response to your question, rather. It is to really find how do we get our policy back on track. And this lawsuit is simply one step, as General Ferguson said, in a series of actions that we need to take in order to get us back on track and address this problem at its root cause.
Thanks, Pete. Just a final thought on my end. You know, in some ways we're limited by time and all that in terms of the scope of the conduct, the illegal conduct from Pharma and the other defendants that Pete's office has sued. But you know, from my perspective, I guess I would just summarize by saying I don't know how executives at Purdue Pharma sleep at night. I mean, I honestly don't. You know, they should talk to Rose, talk to the folks behind us. You know, the devastation is astounding in our state and around the country. And yeah, like I said, I don't know how they sleep at night. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We're available to take questions afterwards. I appreciate your interest, and we're available for questions. Thank you so much, everybody.